Hello, beloveds, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, a podcast for those who are survivors of childhood trauma, emotional neglect, and narcissistic abuse. This podcast is hosted by Rachel Leroy, a college professor and trauma survivor. Many of us spend years trying to heal and don't get anywhere. We don't always target the trauma itself, which is so often what keeps us stuck. This podcast is where faith meets science. Rachel is an emotional healing expert with 20 years of experience applying healing modalities that helped her start making progress after nothing else worked. She'll show you how to do the same. Each week, we'll cover a topic that will show you how to heal trauma for good. Please check out our website and show notes at ChristianEmotionalRecovery.com and join the Facebook community, Trauma Survivors Unite, Christian Emotional Recovery.
Hello, beloveds, and welcome to podcast number 19 on codependency. Just thank you so much for listening to the podcast on Christian Emotional Recovery. Please keep in mind that the podcast is on the podcast site, and you can also find it on YouTube, where there will be some other resources posted soon. And also keep in mind that we have a group called Christian Emotional Recovery, Trauma Survivors Unite, Christian Emotional Recovery. So type those two phrases in, Trauma Survivors Unite, Christian Emotional Recovery, and you can request to join the group. Just make sure you look at the guidelines before you join. But you're more than welcome. And also, please keep in mind that if you're looking for an editor to help you write a Christian healing or self-development book, I might be able to help you with that. Check out my website at rachelleroy.com, RACHELLEROY.com, if you're interested in that. So let's just go ahead and jump right into codependency. Why did I choose codependency as a theme for a podcast? I've thought about this thing for a long time, and I admit that I myself am a recovering codependent, and I believe that codependency is rampant in the Christian community and in the church, and I think that a lot of people have trouble differentiating between agave Christian love and between codependent behavior. And I think that there are even a lot of people who were raised in well-meaning Christian homes like myself who were raised codependent and told that that's what Christian love is. And it's not. And I want to differentiate with some examples between Christian love and codependency because they're not the same thing. One that differentiates them is motive. And another thing that differentiates them is the degree to which you take certain acts or choices. And so we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So today, I thought for codependency, we would talk about what is codependency. Codependency, in my opinion, is also people-pleasing, and I've seen that as a synonymous. It's not all the same. People-pleasing isn't always. People that are non-codependent can people please, and people who are codependent don't necessarily always people please. But I believe that the symptoms and the actions and the motivations are very similar. And I want to talk about what causes codependency, where does it come from, what are the symptoms, and how does it impact our lives and our relationships, including our relationship with God. That's one that you don't always hear about, and I want to talk about that a little bit. And then I also want to talk about some recommended resources because fortunately, where I feel that maybe the Christian community doesn't always provide applicable, body-based approaches that can remove trauma or a certain emotional issue from our lives, I do believe that there's a lot of great Christian resources on codependency. That's just my humble opinion. Two of which are Henry Cloud's book on boundaries and also Joyce Meyer's work. But she uses the term people pleasing. And like I said, I don't want you to think that diagnosis is always exactly the same, but there's a lot of overlap. And so I think if you do teachings on people pleasing, it can definitely help you with codependency. So we'll differentiate those and talk about that. And also, what's the difference between loving your neighbor and codependency? And how many well-meaning people raise their kids into a codependent adult, thinking they were raising them to be loving Christian people, but we're actually teaching them to be doormats and to be run over. There's a difference between loving someone and setting loving boundaries and having no boundaries. And I'll talk about my experience with that in just a little bit. Also, we'll talk about the connection between codependency and trauma. And also, how do you heal from codependency? What do you do? What steps do you take? What are some of the things that you need to do in order to heal the root in the mind? You can't just target. The problem with a lot of courses and teachings and even like just people will say, do this or do that. Don't worry. Don't fear. Blah, 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 blah. That's all great stuff. But a lot of times it's like, oh, how do I do that? And if you just say, I choose not to do it, if you've got trauma in your body, it's not going to just go away. And so I want to talk a little bit about how do I actually heal the roots themselves of codependency, because you can work on the symptoms, and that is important. You need to work on your behaviors, and that does heal the root some, but working on the root cause of why you became codependent anyway, understanding what it is in your mind and where it came from, what went wrong, and then reprogramming those thoughts, those beliefs, that mindset, and that, as you release trauma, you also release a lot of those codependent tendencies and behaviors. So getting to the root cause of your codependency is going to get a lot more done at the end of the day than just treating symptoms. So we'll talk about that as well. So let's go ahead and look at what is codependency. I have an article here, and it's on a website called Psych Central, and it's psychcentral.com/library/symptoms-of-codependency. So it's by Darlene Lancer, and she has a JD and an MFT. But it talks about codependency, and it says it's characterized by a person belonging to a dysfunctional one-sided relationship where one person relies on the other for meeting nearly all their emotional or self-esteem needs. It also describes a relationship that enables another person to maintain that irresponsible, addictive, or underachieving behavior. So I would also argue that codependency is how somebody it can be how people interact with other people in general, how they operate in the world, how they relate to other people, how they handle conflict. I think that when somebody has codependency, and I think I like the term has codependency better than I'm a codependent, because it's something that it's not who you are, it's how you're programmed. And we all know that who we are in Christ, it comes above and is who we are over how we're programmed and the sins that we're prone to. So I like to say someone has codependency, but I believe it's pervasive in every area or most areas or a lot of areas of a person's life when they have codependency. So that's a definition. And what causes codependency? And I think the causes of codependency are complex. And we'll get into this a little bit later when I talk about how Christian parents who are well-meaning often raise children that become codependent adults. And one thing that I think causes codependency is a misunderstanding of what love is, a misunderstanding of how you express love, and a misunderstanding of how you balance self-care, setting boundaries, and expressing care and love for other people. So there's a lot of different facets to codependency, and I think it does get complex. But basically, I believe people that are more prone to codependency are people that were emotionally neglected, emotionally abused, experienced problematic childhoods, had higher levels of trauma and stress and unpredictability in their homes. And I would also argue that codependency can be, I don't believe anybody's born codependent. I don't believe anybody's born that way. I believe they're programmed that way in their childhood or maybe even in their young adulthood when something very strongly imprints onto their mind from some adverse experience, or they're taught a certain way to behave and respond to other people, either through how they're taught or the example that they're set for the people around them. If you're raised by codependents, you're more likely to be one yourself. If you're raised by narcissists, you're more likely to be codependent yourself. And in a lot of cases, you have a narc-codependent relationship, and that dynamic is very common. And in those situations, you usually have one person catering to the other one, walking on eggshells to please the other person, and going out of their way, making sacrifices that are to the point that the other person wouldn't even come close to ever making those sacrifices for the person when the roles are reversed. And to me, there are clear signs of codependency in a relationship that show up based on that. But if somebody is a survivor of narcissistic abuse, or mental, emotional, sexual, physical abuse, or neglect, they're more likely to be codependent. And like I said, they're raised that way, or they're taught to be that way by the people around them by example, by watching their behavior. And it's a coping mechanism that allows someone to respond to a situation, often to respond to trauma or even PTSD. There are 4 ways you can respond to stress and to trauma. You can freeze, you can fight, you can flight, or you can fawn. And I believe codependents tend to fawn, and that's people pleasing. And I think that sometimes they also freeze, which means if somebody's bullying them, they just roll over and they allow that person to just treat them that way because they can't stand conflict. Often codependents learn that if they were just a good little girl or a good little boy, they get good grades, they help mom and dad out, they're a good kid, they don't have a lot of needs, they are extra helpful around the house and with other siblings and with whatever else needs to be done. Maybe they're forced to even grow up earlier than they should. Maybe their mom or their dad or whoever's raising them has a mental health issue or a drug problem, and they're forced to take care of and even parent that parent. And that's sad. In some cases, it might not be helped if the parent is disabled and there's limited resources, or they have a mental illness. But in other cases, the parent is irresponsible and selfish, and the child is forced to grow up and be the parent to the parent that's being the child. In some cases, that's what happens. In other cases, it's tragic, unfortunate situations that's nobody's fault. But nevertheless, it does mold a child into becoming a codependent. So that's a little bit about what causes it. So what are the symptoms of it? According to Psych Central, to Lancer's article, symptoms of codependency can include low self-esteem, and that means feeling you're not good enough or comparing yourself to others. That's signs of low self-esteem. Keep in mind that when somebody has some of these symptoms, it doesn't mean that you're a codependent. And if you're a codependent, that doesn't mean you have all of these symptoms either. So keep that in mind too. Another one, so low self-esteem, people feel unlovable or inadequate. And so they use people pleasing and avoiding conflict and fawning and nurturing and being there for people and helping people to a point that it's excessive. You know, they use that as a way to compensate for not feeling loved or adequate. Do you see the difference? That's where the motive isn't good, but it's also not the person's fault. They're wired that way for whatever reason, and that's not their fault. The only thing that you can do if you are that way is to understand and then to love yourself and let God love you in that situation and take accountability of the behavior and the roots of the behavior so that you can heal it and change it. Another symptom is people pleasing. Like I said, I think they're almost the same, but there's overlap there. You can people please and not be codependent, for example, and not all symptoms of codependency are people pleasing. But it's fine to want to please someone you care about, but codependents usually don't think they have a choice. Saying no causes them anxiety. One of the worst things that codependents have an issue with is saying no when they don't want to do something or when they can't do something. Some codependents have a hard time saying no to anyone. And then they resent obligations that they put themselves in when they say yes, and then they keep themselves quiet about that, and that bitterness can build up. So codependents can have a lot of anger towards people that they feel are taking advantage of them, but if they don't speak up, if they don't say no, if they don't set a boundary, there's no way for those other people to know that. And in some cases, unfortunately, there are people who will take advantage of that and abuse that to the nth degree as well. And that goes into the next one, poor boundaries. And I think that codependency and boundaries boundaries is the number one thing I think that codependency is about, because basically it comes down to having respect for yourself, having a backbone, loving yourself in a healthy way, and learning to say no and being free to say yes for the right reasons. It's not about not helping people. It's not about not making sacrifices. It's about doing it where there's a free will. Even the Bible says God loves a cheerful giver. And reading between the lines, I think that means God doesn't want your money if you feel obligated and angry and resentful to have to give it. God wants you to do things because you want to, out of free will. And that's not codependency. That's overflowing with the love that God gave you, and you just want to give that abundance back to other people and to God's kingdom. And I think that's the difference. Boundaries are sort of an imaginary line between you and others. And I think one reason a lot of people are codependent is because growing up, and this was the case for me, a lot of times people think children are not full people. And it's like children should be seen and not heard kind of thing. I don't know if that's the right wording, but some adults don't think they should apologize to children. They think that their feelings don't matter as much as an adult's. They don't necessarily respect the feelings of their child or the children around them. And I think those, not giving your children a chance to make choices and to have reasonable boundaries is one reason some kids end up being codependent, because people run all over their boundaries and they don't respect their autonomy and their free will as an individual, even as a child who has a spirit that deserves respect in addition to love. It's about respect, I think. When you respect somebody, you respect their boundaries. When you love somebody, you love their boundaries. You don't always have to agree with what they do or what they want, but you still give them the freedom to make their own choices, right? So boundaries are sort of an imaginary line between you and others, the article says. It divides up what's yours and somebody else's, and that applies not only to your body, money, and belongings, but also your feelings, thoughts, and needs. And some people may actually respect the boundaries of your money, body, and belongings, but not your feelings, thoughts, and needs. And I think a lot of well-meaning people will do one but not the other. That's especially where codependents get into trouble. They have blurry or weak boundaries. They feel responsible for other people's feelings and problems and blame their own on someone else. So that would mean if you're in a marriage and you say something. Now, if you say something and it's insensitive and you hurt your husband or your wife's feelings and they call you on it, the best thing to do is just apologize and say, my bad, I screwed up. I'm sorry that I didn't think about that. That was not right to say. But there are situations where you'll say something and it's just a very reasonable, run-of-the-mill thing, and somebody flies off at the handle at you. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe they have a trigger that you didn't know about. And then all of a sudden you feel terrible because you hurt this person's feelings in a situation where it might not be a reasonable or logical response. Their feelings are valid, but the response might not be logical. And so you take responsibility for how they act and how they feel. Or if you're in an abusive relationship with a narcissist and they pitch tantrums and they don't get their way and they get mad at you because you say no about something and it's perfectly reasonable, then that's an example of codependency because you take responsibility for their feelings. Everybody has to keep their own side of the street neat, right? I'm responsible for my feelings. You're responsible for your feelings. And a healthy non-codependent relationship is about keeping that enmeshment free, where you don't get all up in somebody's business and take responsibility for their feelings. It's different to care about them, ask questions, and talk about it than it is to take responsibility and feel guilty if somebody flies off the handle at you, for example. Reactivity, appropriately, is another one. A consequence of poor boundaries is that you react to everyone's thoughts and feelings. That also is a trauma response in many cases. Not everybody who reacts has trauma, and not everybody who has trauma reacts, but reactivity is often a symptom of poor boundaries. And because that fight or flight, that lizard brain, the amygdala, is more activated in a codependent because they've probably experienced more stressors because their boundaries have been invaded more, and on some level their spirit knows that. Caretaking. Once again, caretaking for somebody is not necessarily a bad thing. God calls for us to care for people, but an effect of poor boundaries, the motive behind it can be the thing. It says, if someone else has a problem, you want to help them to the point that you give up yourself. It's natural to feel empathy and sympathy for someone, but codependents start putting other people ahead of themselves, like to the point that they're not even doing basic self-care. In fact, they need help and might feel rejected if another person doesn't want help. So it can actually become somebody wanting to help to the point that it's toxic. Maybe somebody says, you really need help with this. Can I help you? And the person says no. And they're like, well, it would really help if somebody could help you work on this. And the person says, no, thank you. The person doesn't know how to give up. So there are people that actually get in other people's business to the point that it's not helpful, and it's actually, I would call it toxic helpfulness in some cases. Or maybe the other person appreciates it and allows it, but the other person, I don't know, maybe in a family there's somebody who needs round-the-clock care, and say 3 people in the family are supposed to be responsible for caring for this person when the caretaker that you've hired isn't there. And then maybe it's one person that's there day and night, and the other 2 never show up. That is codependency because that person is doing all the work and they don't speak up. That's an example. Another one, control. Kind of like what I was talking about before. They want to help in situations where maybe it's not welcome. Control helps codependents feel safe and secure. And everybody needs some control over events in their life. And that's good. But codependents' control limits their ability to take risks and share their feelings. So they have a need for control to the point that it's compulsive. And sometimes you just need to let go, to surrender, to trust. So that can really affect our relationship with God, because sometimes we can't let things go and let God. And that's not our fault. There was so much time, and I still struggle with this, that I would try to let go of something and surrender it to God, and I just couldn't do it. I tried. And people would tell me, you're not trying hard enough. You don't have enough faith. You're missing a step. No, I wasn't. I had a trauma response. My brain was wired in a way where it literally would not allow me to let go. So you have to do this healing work. Get to the roots of your codependency and your trauma. And as you work some of that junk out of your body, out of your neural network, out of your system, then being able to viscerally, literally let go of control and give something to God becomes possible. Dysfunctional communication is another one. I know some people that have issues with this, and I have issues with it, control and boundaries. I'll be honest, I'm working on those. But dysfunctional communication, codependents have trouble when it comes to communicating their thoughts, feelings, and needs. So sometimes they have trouble speaking up and giving their opinion about something. We as a society, I think a lot of people, that we tend to take extremes. Online now there are trolls, and people will just say the ugliest, rudest, meanest things for no reason, or just because somebody disagrees with them. Maybe one person's a Trump supporter and another person doesn't like Trump and doesn't agree with what he stands for and the kind of person he is. And those two people get in a debate, and the Trump supporter completely trashes the character of the person that doesn't support Trump, or the person that doesn't support Trump completely trashes the other person, and maybe they didn't even say anything. And in cases like that, it's the other extreme. But then in other cases, maybe there's a situation where you should speak up where somebody's being bullied, or where somebody asks your opinion and you don't want to hurt their feelings, or when you don't want to do something and you don't say anything. So in those cases, you can feel out of control and to the point that you don't even know who you are and what you really want. Obsessions. Codependents have a tendency to spend their time thinking about other people and relationships. They obsess over, what does this person think of me? Does this person like me? Do they like me? Do they want me? And everybody cares what other people think, because it's our evolutionary instinct to be part of the group. It's a survival response. However, with codependence, it's taken to a very extreme degree. A person's very self-worth is based on whether somebody likes them or not, whether people like them or not, what people think of them. And when it gets to that point, it's unhealthy compared to just caring about it. If somebody doesn't like you, you might be hurt a little, and then you move on and you're like, it doesn't change how you feel about yourself. That's a healthy response to a situation like that. A codependent is completely wiped out when somebody doesn't like them, or even if they make a slight disapproving comment, it can just completely wipe them out. I used to be that way. I'm working on it. I'm getting better, and I'm actually liberated, because there are times where I've had somebody react negatively to me, and I've actually been able to laugh about it, and that's so liberating. And it's, I'm not trying to be cold, but it can be so liberating if you've been imprisoned by what other people think of you your whole life, and you've stayed small and quiet because of it, and then suddenly, or not suddenly, but over time, you are able to speak up, be yourself, be an honest, authentic person that God made you to be. And that's what God wants for you. Denial is another one, and denial is more than a river in Egypt, okay? So one of the problems people face in getting help for codependency is that they're in denial about it. Narcissists are usually in denial to the point that they never get help and they rarely heal, and that's sad. I'm not saying it can't be done, but accountability is something that, for whatever reason, people on the narcissistic spectrum don't usually get help. Codependents can and do, and they can heal from their codependency. So, like I say, but there's still an element of denial there. They'll complain about being mistreated by somebody, and then sometimes they won't set boundaries with that person, or they won't go get help with their own codependency so they can figure out how to fix the relationships that are fixable and end the ones that are abusive, where people won't respect their boundaries that they're setting. Problems with intimacy. The problem with codependence is that they crave, like it's a drug, intimacy, connection, closeness with people, but then they push it away at the same time. It's not logical. But the reason for that is because they haven't been able to have the bonds that they needed to begin with. Maybe they just didn't bond with their mother or their father. Maybe they weren't held. There's proof that the first 2 months of life, there's more brain development in the child's body. And if they get that touch and they feel safe and they're held, and when they cry, somebody responds to them, then they're able to develop that part of the brain that where a lot of that comes from. And so some people that are codependent, it could go back that far, and they're still craving that bond that they never got. But at the same time, they push it away because they're afraid they'll be judged, rejected, or abandoned. And because they were abandoned on some level when they were younger, that fear actually makes a lot of sense. And then another one is painful emotions. Codependency creates stress and leads to painful emotions. Shame, low self-esteem, anxiety, fear, depression, and things like that. Feeling trapped, abandoned, scared of making mistakes, scared of taking risks. So those are some of the symptoms of codependency from the article Psych Central put out, and it's called Symptoms of Codependency, and it is by Darlene Lancer. Okay, so that was the source on causes of codependency and symptoms of them. So what is the difference? Some of this is just my point of view from my experience, and I have extensive experience reflecting on, reading about, learning to overcome, and studying codependency. So, I think I have a little bit of insight here, but please keep in mind that this is just my perspective, my humble opinion, and I could be wrong about anything and everything. And as I grow and evolve, my points of view do, just like anybody's. But so, like I said, what's the difference between loving your neighbor and codependency? I think one of the best books that I've read that tells you the difference between loving your neighbor and codependency, and this is written by a couple of Christian guys. It's Henry Cloud and John Townsend. And it's called Boundaries. Simple enough. Boundaries. But if you look that up, that book covers pretty much every area of a person's life when it comes to boundaries. And they do talk a lot about codependency. And I think that book, if you're codependent, it's very confusing. It's like everything is a blur. It's a fog. It's nebulous. And you don't know when, like for me, I don't know when setting a healthy boundary is selfish, and I don't know when helping somebody is codependent. And all of that just gets meshed and blurred together, and there's no differentiation. To me, that is codependency. It's just a mishmash. And I think loving your neighbor means that you help people on a regular basis. You help people when you can, and you love people wherever you're at and whatever you're doing. At times it requires sacrifice. At times it requires keeping your mouth shut when you want to say something. At times it requires speaking up when you want to stay quiet because you're shy or scared. But loving your neighbor, I think, is pretty obvious. But codependency, it gets to the point where if anybody's in need anywhere, you help them all the time, you're constantly drained, your fuel tank is empty, you are burnt out, you don't do anything for yourself, you don't set boundaries with people, you don't say no. People like that are often, though not always, codependent, but that is a good sign of the difference between being codependent and loving your neighbor. Okay? So, an example. This is kind of personal, but let's say there's a couple who are their foster parents, and they want to help people. They want to bring children into their home and make a difference in their life. So they take in 2 foster kids. They have 2 bedrooms. They work full time, and they have 2 other kids. And so you've got 2 kids to a room and 2 bedrooms. And like I said, this is just my opinion. And they are almost run ragged. Their house is messy a lot of the time. And they are helping these kids. They're in a better place than they were wherever they were before. And then like I said, I'm not saying don't help people, but you also have to use some common sense about helping people. And they are right at where they can handle in terms of their mental, physical, and spatial resources. The time that they have, the energy they have, all that, to help these kids and their own kids. And the DFACS calls and says, we have 3 more kids that need a home. And the parents say yes, and they throw them in the living room. And the house is full of chaos. Their own kids are neglected. The house is starting to look like something from Hoarders. The kids are not going to the doctor like they need to. There's behavioral problems. They're not getting the attention they need. They're not getting their medicine. The parents are sleeping 4 hours a night, and they're up 3 times a night with maybe toddlers and small kids. And the place is just complete chaos, and their own children are getting completely neglected, and the other foster kids are getting completely neglected. In my opinion, that would be a clear-cut case of codependency. You can only do so much. You can help people, but you, like I said, have to use common sense in terms of what you can do as well, because everybody has limitations. And Like I said, I'm not saying leave somebody in need in the lurch, but at the same time, you can't do everything. And that's not something that you hear a lot of Christians say, but I'm going to say it. You can't do everything. Everybody has limitations, and that's okay. If you're doing so much that you're headed for a mental breakdown, that's a clear case of codependency. Okay? So I think that's differentiating between loving your neighbor and codependency. So I want to talk a little bit about how well-meaning parents raise kids into codependent adults, Christian parents in particular. I was raised by one parent who was codependent. I believe, in my opinion, that my other parent was a narcissist. And this parent is a wonderful Christian parent, human being, and these people walk the walk. They don't just talk the talk. They are constantly giving to people. They're constantly bringing people into their homes to stay and to live with them. They taught us how to love other people, how to give to other people. But what happened in that process, too, was there were no boundaries. There was chaos. There was reactivity. There was anger. There was no control of one's emotions. And there were times where the basic needs of the house or people in the home were not met. And I believe I'm a product of emotional neglect. Kids can go to the doctor and be given vacations and be told that they're loved and taught morals and stuff, but I was taught that if somebody was in need, implicitly through action and in words, that I was obligated to help them no matter what. And the concept of boundaries was something that I observed in my extended family who were strong, good Christian people. They would say no to people, and my mom or my dad or somebody would be like jealous of them, almost like thinking they were selfish. But they were helping people. They were actively involved in their church. They were giving money. They were doing service. They were going on missions. But there were times where they would just say no. And they didn't have a problem with that. And their house was clean and things were in order and their kids were taken care of. And their kids' emotional needs may not have been perfectly met, but they were met overall. And to me, that's the difference between a codependent home and a non-codependent home. If you were raised by parents that said, you're not allowed to say no if somebody needs something. If somebody bullies you and runs over you, you don't say anything. Let's put it this way. I remember my aunt teaching her children at a church. They would draw these pictures of serpents, of Satan, and they represented Satan, and then they would put them on the floor and stomp on them. That Satan was under my feet. I'm the head, not the tail. So it was teaching these kids authority in Christ in an unconventional way, but it got the point across, And when I told my mom that I hated Satan, I didn't like Satan, she says, you can't hate anybody. You've got to love everybody, including Satan. And that did not make sense to me. So I can't stomp on Satan. I can't rebuke Satan. She basically said no. And to me, that's codependent. Yes, you can step on Satan, and yes, you can put him under your feet. As a matter of fact, that's where he belongs. And so that's just an example of how the codependency of loving other people, it bleeds into areas where there's no boundaries. Love has boundaries. Love sets healthy boundaries with people. The other thing, I'm not a parent, but I've observed enough, and I've been a child of a parent myself enough to know that love also sets boundaries with children. And, we live in a time where there's more kids that are entitled, to the point that if a kid is doing something flat out wrong and it's bothering and affecting other people, and then say, the parent's not around, you don't know where they are, and you just kindly walk over to the child and say, hey, can you please stop doing that? That's not very nice. And you say it very nicely. The kid back talks you. Then the parent walks up and they're like, how dare you talk to my child and tell them what to do? And they don't discipline their child at all. That's a clear-cut case of entitlement, and that's a case where the parent is not raising their children with any boundaries, and they're going to turn them into little narcissists. And there could also be a case of codependency there. Codependents often have trouble setting boundaries with people, including children. And I'm not even going to talk about how hard it is to raise a child, how hard it is to set boundaries, especially when children are pitching a fit or are disappointed or whatnot, that is so freaking hard. And parenting is not for everybody, but that setting the right boundaries in a loving way teaches kids behavior, and it prevents narcissism and codependency, I believe, when there's love, discipline, and kindness, when the child's needs are met, but there are clear boundaries that are reasonable and healthy. I think that's the difference between codependency and Christian love. And that's just my opinion. Like I said, I think that the Henry Cloud, John Townsend Boundaries book is excellent at differentiating between those things. So what does people-pleasing do to your relationship with God? Look at and study a lot of Joyce Meyer's teachings. She has a lot on these. She talks about how if you put what other people think or your relationship with other people over God, over what God thinks, and over your relationship with God, that can be idolatry, for one. And number two, it's also codependency, I believe, in many cases. Maybe not always. But for example, let's say that you have some friends. I have a lot of non-Christian friends. I have a lot of friends that don't believe what I do. I have friends who are from other faiths. I have friends who are agnostic and atheists. That's fine. I have no problem with that. I respect everybody's right to choose their beliefs. However, let's say that you're in a situation where you have friends and they're mocking God and they're mocking Christianity. I mean, they're doing it in a cold, ugly way. They're just sitting there joking about it. And you just sit there and you're kind of uneasy laughing with them and you don't say anything. I think that's a case where you're putting what other people think of you above your relationship with God. Now, I'm not saying you need to get reactionary or ugly. That's actually the last thing you need to do. But in that situation, you might just calmly and humbly tell them your opinion and what God's done in your life briefly, and then just leave it, say your piece. You have told people, that is something that you don't necessarily believe, you don't necessarily agree with, but you've done it in a firm and kind way. And so I think that's the difference between people pleasing and doing this. Another one for me, this podcast. I'm scared to share private things about my life and about my emotional healing. And I'm worried about what people will think of me. I don't like sharing intimate details of my emotional life with people. But it got to a point where I knew God wanted me to start this podcast and this platform to the point that I could not ignore it. And if I did ignore it, I was putting worrying about what other people thought of me and staying small above speaking out, speaking up, and fulfilling God's purpose for my life above that. So that's another case where people pleasing or worrying about what other people think can actually impact your relationship with God. But I think you get the point. So like I said, that's my opinion, that's my experience, and I know a lot of people have different opinions and experiences on that, and that's fine. So what's the connection between trauma bonding, between childhood trauma and codependency? Trauma bonding is a key term in that whole process. And I'll talk about it briefly in just a minute, but I'll have a whole other podcast on trauma bonding, so I don't want to get into that too much in this one. But trauma and codependency, there's another article on Psych Central and in the library by Darlene Lancer, the same one that did the other article, and it's called Trauma and Codependency. And it says that you can make significant strides by overcoming codependency by developing new attitudes, skills, and behavior. So some of that is the roots, but overall that's the symptoms. She says the same thing that I did, but deeper recovery may involve healing trauma that usually began in childhood. Trauma can be emotional, physical, or environmental, and it can range from emotional neglect to experiencing a fire. Childhood events had a greater impact on you than they would today because you didn't have the coping skills that an adult would have. I would also argue that your brain was still developing. And as a consequence of growing up in a dysfunctional family environment, codependents often suffer further trauma due to relationships with other people who may be abandoning, abusive, addicted, or have mental illness. That doesn't mean that codependents don't end up in good relationships and have good marriages. I know a lot of people who grew up in adverse circumstances, became codependents, and still somehow they're blessed with a wonderful partner, a wonderful spouse, or wonderful friends, or they have a great family in other ways. So childhood itself may be traumatic when it's not safe to be spontaneous, vulnerable, or authentic. It's emotionally damaging if you are ignored, shamed, or punished for expressing your thoughts or feelings, or for being immature, imperfect, or having needs and wants. And when my codependency was at its worst, I was so needy and so clingy, and I've learned so much more to rely on God and to rely on myself for things that I used to not. And there's nothing wrong with needing help. There's nothing wrong with asking for support, but it's when you can't do without having somebody else's help in all these situations. Some people are neglected and emotionally or physically abandoned and conclude they can't trust or rely on anyone. They hide their real child self and play an adult role before they're ready. And then it just goes on to talk about specific events that can cause trauma, and it talks about the symptoms of trauma, which are many, many more than just codependency. It talks about PTSD, and then the ACE study of trauma, which is adverse childhood experiences, and this is basically Psych 101 now. Like, people, this is established, this is respected, most experts agree with this concept, but it's basically a correlation between specific factors that you can count and trauma. And if you have a high level of those factors, like specific kinds of abuse, drug abuse, mental illness, neglect, then that increases your chances of having experienced trauma. Other traumatic experiences would be specific events or health problems. Effects of childhood trauma could be drugs, medical illness, surgery, accidents, deaths in the family, drug use, and so forth and so on. And then it talks about the treatments of trauma. But basically, if you experienced higher ACE scores, you're more likely to be codependent or even be on the narcissistic spectrum. But basically, if you work on healing that connection between trauma and codependency, then your codependency, along with doing specific things like setting boundaries, educating yourself, learning to turn this stuff over to God in a visceral way, those are the things that will help you to heal over time. And I have a whole podcast on treatments for trauma, but they can also help for codependency and for emotional and mental difficult emotions, emotional hurt, and mental illness. So check out the podcast on treatments and practices that can help you heal your visceral trauma, and that will help you to think about how codependency is connected to that, and you can work on the root causes of that. So that's why I said healing the root and not just taking care of the symptoms is vital. You also want to work on the behavior, but working on the symptoms alone isn't enough. Working out the roots of your codependency, where it came from, what caused it, what went wrong, understanding that that's not your fault, and doing the work, the journaling, the praying, the meditating, the exercises, all that stuff to heal and reprogram your brain. That's how you're going to overcome the codependency. So a lot of the other podcasts talk about that. So for more information on that, go there. But I would recommend starting with some teachings from Joyce Meyer on people pleasing. So it helps you in terms of your relationships with other people and God. And I would encourage you to go look at the Townsend and Cloud book called Boundaries. Those are two great places to start. There's also a lot more books. There's a lot more podcasts. There's a lot more teachings, and there's a lot more courses and all kinds of stuff out there. So explore and see what's out there, because there's a lot. But that was pretty much my podcast on codependency. I wanted to talk about what it was, where it came from, how it's uniquely, like in a uniquely Christian experience, how it can get enmeshed with loving other people, and the difference between loving other people in a healthy way and when you're taught distorted perceptions of love. And I wanted to talk also about the symptoms and how to heal that stuff from the root. Where does it come from? How do you heal it? Knowing how to heal it comes from knowing where it comes from. So I'm Rachel Leroy. This is Christian Emotional Recovery Podcast. check out my YouTube channel called Stop Striving and Start Thriving, Christian Emotional Recovery. Also check out my Facebook channel called Trauma Survivors Unite, Christian Emotional Recovery. Feel free to join. And also, if you are a writer and you want to work on a Christian living, memoir, healing, or self-development book and you need help with that, check out rachelleroy.com. I'll be glad to help you. We can set up a time to talk. rachelleroy.com. So thank you so much for listening to me, and I hope that this podcast has educated you, empowered you, enlightened you, and blessed you. And know that you are loved, you are worth it, God loves you, and you are significant. We need the gift that you and only you can provide, as Marie Forleo says. Thank you so much. God bless, and have a great day.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Christian Emotional Recovery, hosted by Rachel Leroy. For links to this week's resources and to join the discussion, check out this episode's show notes at christianemotionalrecovery.com, where you can also find links to our YouTube channel and Facebook group. Join our email list and get other episodes and resources. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review the podcast and tell a friend who may benefit from this message. See you next time. And remember, beloveds, God loves you, and you are fearfully and wonderfully made.